series. I'll just make a few introductory comments before we start. I'm Neil Ward. I'm based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the AFN Network Plus, which is a network focused on the UK agri-food system and identifying and tackling the barriers to transitioning to a net zero UK by 2050. We're funded by UKRI, which is the umbrella body for the British Research Councils, for 3 years up until mid-2025. We're a partnership of about 11 higher education and research institutions and 63 stakeholder partner bodies. We've got about 500 members to date, and we're gathering together people and organisations from across the UK agri-food system, hosting a range of activities to promote interactions, connections and knowledge exchange. We'll be commissioning some research projects in 2023 and 2024. We're holding an event later this week in Leeds to discuss some of our work on future scenarios for the UK food system and the research priorities that follow from that. You can sign up to be a member of the network if you're not already, and my colleague Jez will put a link in the chat to help you link to our webpage where you can join up. Today is our third webinar in our series, and we're very pleased to have Henry Dimbleby with us. I'm not sure Henry will need much introduction, but for those of you who don't know, Henry was the lead for the National Food Strategy, which was published in 2021. He has a background in a food business as co-founder of the restaurant chain Leon and of the Sustainable Restaurant Association. In 2013, he co-authored the School Food Plan, which sets out actions to transform school meals and food education in schools. He's recently departed from his role as a non-exec director of DEFRA, but for the last 5 or 6 years, he's been very, very involved in UK national food policy debates, and I'm sure many of you will agree that the National Food Strategy has been a really important contribution. Henry's going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. If you can type your questions in the chat, we will go through them and put them to Henry. We will make sure that we finish at 2 o'clock absolutely prompt, so we won't run over. We're recording the session and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be identified as participating, then probably best not to ask a question, or ask a friend to ask a question. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Henry, who's going to talk to us a bit about his thinking on where things are at with change in the agri-food system. So Henry, thanks very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thanks for having me here today, and for so many of you for coming. I thought it might be, as soon as we published the food strategy, which the second part went out in July 2021, I turned to my wife pretty much the next day, and she's a journalist who had very kindly worked for free, both on the food strategy and on the school food plan, helping edit it. She's called Jemima Lewis and is the co-author of the book. And I said to her, look, we're going to have to turn this into a book, because one of the prerequisites for changing a complex system is that people understand how that system works. And one of the problems with the food system is that actually not only do people not understand it, but the way in which they think it works is not the way in which it works. There's a widespread misunderstanding of actually why it causes the problems that it causes. And so almost immediately we decided to write the book, and the book really is trying to do just that. It's trying to set out at a high level. We knew no one was going to, very few people, I'm sure there might be some people on this call, but very few people are going to download a government document from a website, and we wanted to get the ideas, to set the ideas free and get them out there. And I thought what might be useful today is just to very briefly, in this short period at the start of the call, just to run through those ideas and then spend most of the discussion as a Q&A with you probing where you want to probe. I think the first, where I always start when I tell the story is, how did we get here? And, you know, that is, hold on, I'm just going to try and move this, just going to try and move the slide on a bit, if you bear with me 1 second. Yeah, so when you're trying to understand why our food system is in such trouble, it's important to remember how we got here. And the food system we have is as the result of extraordinary human ingenuity. At the end of the Second World War, despite all the bloodshed, we had 2.5 billion people living on the planet, and that was projected to grow over the next 50 years to about 8 billion people. And at that stage, up until then, as the population of the planet had grown, the way in which we'd fed ourselves was to dig up more land and plant more crops. And pretty much, if you look from the kind of the beginning of the 18th century to the war, if you look at 3 lines on a chart, with the green one being the amount of land that we use to farm, the grey line being the amount of food we produce, and the red line being the number of people, over the course of human history, they had basically increased together. But that wasn't going to be possible in 1945 because there simply wasn't going to be enough land to produce food to feed that many people. And obviously, as everyone on this call will know, the people who are predicting Malthusian collapse, that we would run out of food, hadn't reckoned on Norman Borlaug and the Green Revolution. So Borlaug was a botanist from Idaho who had grown up in the Great Depression, seeing starvation straight up, seeing food riots, and he had set on a course to ensure that people had enough food to eat. And that led him towards the end of the war to Mexico, where he was being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, left on his own pretty much to his own devices in Mexico, trying to improve the farming systems there. He'd written to his wife, and we talk about this in the book, that the land and the people there had clubbed his mind. The soil was so poor and the people were barely scraping by, and that he had to do something about it, but he didn't know what. And what he did was he bred a short-stemmed, high-yielding, rust-resistant wheat, which combined with industrial fertilizers and modern irrigation techniques, completely transformed Mexican agriculture. When he arrived, Mexico was importing more than half its wheat. By 1960, Mexico was exporting wheat. And that experiment was repeated for maize and for rice, and the Green Revolution came about. And if you look at what happened, the human population grew as was projected. The amount of land we used to grow our food actually decreased at the end of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of poor quality collectivized land came out of production, but the amount of calories that we produced from that land massively increased. It's one of the great stories of human ingenuity. Probably 2/3 of the people on this planet, if you switched off these farming techniques immediately, would not be able to be fed. But as is often the case, when you intervene to kind of fix a system, to fix just one thing, and really he was looking at yield from land, you create other problems. And the first problem, again, as everyone on this call will be aware, is that the farming system has completely overtaken our environment. It's completely overtaken our ecosystems. It's the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. It's the biggest cause of freshwater pollution and shortage. It's the biggest cause of collapse of life in the oceans, of deforestation, and after climate change, It's the second biggest cause. The food system is the second biggest cause of, after energy, sorry, it's the second biggest cause of greenhouse gas production. And the chart that kind of, for me, when I was doing the food strategy, really brought this home was looking at the biomass of wild animals. This is vertebrates and land-dwelling vertebrates and birds, compared to people in 10,000 BC, the beginning of the Holocene, where we began to produce food. There were 1 million or so people on the planet at the time, dwarfed by the number of wild animals. And then if you look at the biomass of those groups now, what you see is obviously people, the biomass is much greater. The population of wild animals has collapsed, and the animals that we keep as pets, dogs, horses, cats, weigh almost as much as all the wild animals, and the animals that we rear to eat weigh twice as much at any one point as all the people on the planet, and 20 times as much as the wild animals. And unsurprisingly, that has had a huge effect on biodiversity, and it's continuing. So this chart shows over the last only 50 years what's happened, and wheat increases. Wheat's almost doubled, so we've continued through the Green Revolution to improve our wheat yields. But farmyard bird populations have collapsed, have halved. We have the lowest level of farmyard birds on our farms of any country in Europe. And more frighteningly, the food system has become the thing that is imperiling the food system. The way we eat is imperiling the way we eat. This is a chart that many of you will see, and there are a couple of versions. I think there are 3 versions. The 2 that are best known, one was done by NASA and one was done by the UN. And they show a projection of what yields might look like in a world where the planet is warmed by 2.5 degrees. And what you see is a band of green across the northern hemisphere, and that's wheat yields. And then which have increased because carbon dioxide has increased and the planet's become warmer. And then you see on the bottom these red and yellow yield decreases of rice and of maize. And whenever I look at this, it looks to me like famine, warfare, mass migration. I think it's the most terrifying chart that we saw while we were doing the food strategy. And I won't spend too much time on this today. It's not just the environment that is being challenged by this food system, it's our health. This is the causes of non-communicable disease, and the food system, diet-related disease is now by far the biggest cause of non-communicable disease. If you want to get a sense of how big an issue it is, Chris Whitty was giving a lecture during lockdown on the problem, because people who work close to the NHS see this as bringing down the NHS. By 2035, type 2 diabetes alone, which is just one of these conditions, is projected to cost more to the NHS today than treating all cancers does. It's going to be a huge problem. And if you look at, it's not just coming from that. I mean, what that means is, because we won't be able to let the NHS collapse, it'll suck money from out of the rest of the state. But if you look at the other side of the balance sheet, Andy Haldane, who is the governor of the Bank of England, made an extraordinary speech a few weeks ago saying that he believed that ill health was now the biggest drag on economic growth in this country. So basically what you see is the NHS sucking all the money from other government departments, at the same time GDP not growing, tax receipts going down, and us ending up both impoverished and sick. And I won't go through this in detail, but those harms, this shows that on the left-hand side of each of these charts, it shows the poorest 10% of postcodes, and on the right-hand side, it shows the richest. And for all of those harms, preventable mortality, heart disease, overweight, obesity, dental decay, and so forth, that they are prevalent throughout society. but they are visited in a more concentrated fashion on the people who live in the poorest postcodes. So what do you do about it? One of the great things about doing a government review is that you can talk to anyone in the world about what the problems are. And it's an extraordinary privilege, and particularly in COVID, you could basically get anyone on a Zoom anywhere in the world within a few days. And the first thing we did is we spoke to a lot of people worldwide about how we tackle these problems, and they all talked about taking a systems approach. And we said, well, what do you mean by a systems approach? And we were quite often shown this map, which is the Foresight obesity map, which was taken from another previous bit of government work on very specifically on obesity. And it shows all of the different connections that lead to obesity in terms of environment, genetics, upbringing, and so forth. And it is very interesting, but as a policy document, it is probably it's not particularly useful, and in some ways it's counterproductive, because you show it to a politician and they go, well, we're never going to do anything about that, are we? Whereas you can do things about complex systems, and we'll talk about how. The second thing we were shown was this chart, which actually is incredibly useful. It shows how the responsibilities for intervening in the food system are spread across government departments. And this is a real problem. Let me give you two examples. So one is on health, advertising restrictions, which the government was going to bring in and then didn't. You had, during those conversations, the Department for Health and Social Care saying we need to restrict advertising on junk food, and you had DEFRA arguing this was going to impact food businesses, and you had the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, as then was, arguing that it was going to destroy children's television programs and that ITV would go bust. So you had these tensions, and you only need a bit of grit in the wheel to stop things happening. Another example at the moment is the environmental land management reforms in DEFRA. So when we'll talk about the land use framework, but when we think about how we want to use our land, I cannot see how the environmental land management scheme works without liberation of planning to enable, in particular in the uplands, people to use the to build leisure facilities to enable more people to come and see the rewilded uplands and make their revenue from that rather than grazing sheep. But that requires close cooperation between the DLUC, the Department for Housing and Levelling Up, and DEFRA, and those things, unless you have secretaries of state who get on, are often quite tricky. What we found most useful in terms of understanding the systems was the science of system dynamics, which is really interesting. Ian Boyd, who when I started at DEFRA was the chief scientific officer in DEFRA, and his speciality is a biologist who specialized in energy circulation within ecosystems, how different ecosystems distribute energy between the various life forms that live in them. And he pointed out that system dynamics is one of the few sciences that actually has come from business and moved into biology rather than the other way around. And basically what it teaches you is to look for the feedback loops that are going wrong in a system. And before, we quote in the book W.E. Deming saying that a bad system will beat a good person every time. If you're going to create a better system, you need to fix these feedback loops. And there were two obviously going wrong in the food system. One is what we call the junk food cycle, which I won't talk about today too much, but basically we have an appetite that responds for evolutionary reasons to give us huge pleasure from foods that do us harm and not to get full as quickly. And food companies are spending a hugely disproportionate amount of their marketing, an increasing amount of their marketing and research marketing these foods to us, and we're eating too much and we're getting sick. Those foods, if you look at the portfolios of the big processed food companies, 85% of the food that they produce is deemed by the WHO to be unfit to market, too unhealthy to market to children. And this is what we spend in the UK on confectionery in 1 year, 3.9 billion, versus on fruit and veg, 2.2 billion. So we need to change that. We need to break that junk food cycle. We probably won't talk about it today. We actually need to make a better environment. I'm very worried that what the government will end up doing is just trying to drug our appetites, because it's a interaction between appetite and commercial incentives, and it might be easier to drug our appetites, which I think will store up a lot of problems for the longer term. The second big feedback loop is the invisibility of nature, and this is a phrase from Partha Dasgupta's Economics of Biodiversity, which if you haven't read, you should definitely read. It's an extraordinary piece of work. The only downside is that the 600-page full thing is really the only thing worth reading. Partha resisted doing a summary because he said this is the work, and it is extraordinary, but you have to read the full 600 pages, but it will change your life. What he pointed out is that nature is not only quite difficult to measure because it's silent, invisible, and often mobile, but also that measure is not included in any of the systems that we use to measure human success. So you don't see nature in the balance sheets of companies, in wallets, in GDP, and that means that pretty much, or a large portion of our economic growth over the last 50 years has actually come as a result of destroying nature, borrowing from nature to destroy that to create economic growth. He estimates that not only do we not cost nature, that we subsidize nature, the destruction of nature globally, by about $500 million every year, which causes $4 to $6 trillion worth of damage with subsidies to industrial farming, fossil fuels, fishing, and so forth. So how do you break that cycle? Because this is what we're here to talk about today. What the government is doing is actually theoretically the right thing. So, you know, the Natural Capital Committee laid out very clearly, you need to pay public money for public goods. You need to regulate to ensure that the polluter pays. And if you do those two things, you can gradually move to a better system. But you need to think about land differently. And this is where it gets complicated. So this is a chart showing how we use the land that's used to feed us. Over 80% of the land, and this is on the right-hand side, it is land abroad that is used to feed us. And on the left-hand side, it's land in the UK. We feed ourselves off an area of land bigger than the UK. And over 80% of that land is used to rear animals or rear food to feed to animals. And if we're going to sequester carbon, restore biodiversity, and have enough food to eat, we need to reduce the amount of food we eat, but also we need to think quite carefully about how the incentives in the environmental land management scheme work, so that we are, and the regulations, so that we're incentivizing the restoration of nature and sequestering of carbon in areas which are suited to it, but we continue to have the right amount of food. So that is to create a land use framework to do that, and to subsidize, and to get those subsidies right is very difficult for two reasons. First of all, it's just complicated, and you don't know when you're intervening in a complex system really what will happen. And so there is an element of trial and error to this. Some of the things the government will pay too much for, some they'll pay too little. What they do won't work. And if you look at Dartmoor at the moment, it's a classic example of that. The commoners worked with Natural England to put in place a series of rules which they thought would restore nature, and it hasn't, and they're having to go back to the drawing board. So the first point is a bit of trial and error, it's complicated. The second point is it is enormously political. So you're trying to intervene in an area where you get things wrong, and if you get things wrong, it might bring the whole program to a halt. So this is a 10, 15 plus year program. It will take an enormous amount of political skill from whoever it is in power over multiple administrations to get it right. So what does it look like finally when it's done? Well, if we want to meet our both dietary and environmental, have a form of agriculture and food system that is both from a dietary perspective and an environmental perspective works, we need to eat about 30% more vegetables, about 50% more fiber. We need to eat about 25% less junk food and reduce meat eating by about 30%. And we set out in the strategy a series of actions that need to achieve 4 objectives: break that junk food cycle, as I described, reduce diet-related inequality. So actually, there's a benefit of taking some of the money from sugar and salt reformulation taxes and directly targeting that at people living in poverty. We need to get elms right to make the best use of our land. And we could maybe talk about this. I actually think we cannot give up on, we cannot say our food culture is broken, you know, the genie's out of the bottle. We need to, and we talk about this a lot in the book, in the chapter Power of Love, we actually need to work together as citizens and the government to create a better food culture. And that is possible, but it takes, and it's been done in other countries, it's been done in this country actually in the past, but it takes effort. So I think I'll end there for the moment, and maybe I think Neil wants to get into some more nitty-gritty political implementation points, but that's a kind of overview, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks very much, Henry. That was a great sort of potted version of the analysis. And of course, what I forgot to do when introducing you, mentioning the National Food Strategy, was mention the book as well. But you had that up on slide 1, so everyone could see that. And I just read it this last week. There's a chapter I wanted to pick up on actually, which where you paused your talk at the end there. I think it poses this question: is your chapter in the book, "Should Nanny Tell Us What to Eat?" Where you make the really enjoyable point actually that just a quote: "The term nanny state was coined in this country by a ruling class of men raised by nannies." And I guess there is a sort of a distinctively English and British sort of dimension to this, although I know it's very politically contested in the countries like the US as well. The sort of scope of state action and the sort of the legitimate boundary for where government gets involved in people's sort of activities and decisions. So I just wondered what's your sense of the sort of shifting politics and sensitivities around the nanny state issue with the food system?
I think that that both parties have got this completely wrong from an electoral perspective. We did a lot of work in terms of, we had dialogues with citizens in every part of the country to kind of get input early on in the process. And then when we had our recommendations, we tested them first qualitatively. So we'd have focus groups, we kind of phrase them in different ways, frame them in different ways, and then quantitatively. So we'd see what the support was for each of the policies. And there were some things that were very difficult and contested. Meat eating, it's quite difficult. There were the focus groups on those became very polarized very quickly. But on health, I think there is a lot of room for movement on health. And you go back to, interestingly, to smoking, for example, and the banning of smoking. People said, oh, you're never going to be able to do this, could play very badly in the Red Wall. It wasn't called the Red Wall then. And actually, people understood exactly what it was for. And it was, in the end, it got done with very little pushback. And the same is true on health. People are fed up with their children being advertised junk food. They know what's going wrong. And I think if you add that instinctive understanding, you explain that if we don't create a very different world, then you're going to have the situation where the NHS collapses and we have no tax revenue, or much less tax revenue. I think that there is huge, there's a lot of room for intervention. So I think it takes, and fun enough, I'm working now, I had a meeting this morning, I'm working with a bunch of politicians who really get this, cross-party, to try and just to frame that in the right way and ram that home. Because at the moment, it's slightly becoming a kind of culture war thing. Or, you know, obviously it's always been a thing in the Tory party, but I've noticed, I've spoken to Labour politicians, they're beginning to kind of, you know, talk about, you know, oh, I like my junk food, as you know, because that's part of getting down with the citizens, and not thinking that somehow the red wall doesn't like intervention on health. And I think they've got that wrong. So we need to make sure that both parties understand that if they don't do something, they need to explain this properly, because if they don't, we're going to be in real trouble.
I think the science suggests that the emissions benefits from a healthy diet are greater than just a sort of worrying about climate change and a sustainable diet. In other words, the reform would have to go further to meet health objectives than just meeting climate change objectives. And so I guess, could you just explore that sort of the difference in rationale between...
I try to slightly shy away from that argument. So there is a school of thought that people, which is true, that people care more about their health than they do about the environment. That's true. It is also the case that certain forms of meat eating, in particular processed meat, you know, bacon, sausages with nitrates in them, and red meat, which has heme iron in it, which causes bowel cancer, that we need to reduce the amount of meat eating, the amount of meat we eat. However, it is also the case that it is possible to eat meat and be really healthy. And so some people say, because people won't change their behavior from environmental reasons, because for environmental reasons, we need to reduce by 30% by 2035, probably 50% in total. Because people won't do that, let's use the health argument and tell them they need to reduce it. So that worries me, because I think you have to, in the end, with your framing, you have to be straight with framing. And I think that framing falls apart slightly. So funny enough, one of the bits of work I'm doing at the moment is with M&C Saatchi, who read the food strategy and decided they want to do some pro bono work on it. And we're working together on how do you frame meat reduction so that it cuts through to a large number of people in the population without threatening them or making them think, you know, they're never going to have a barbecue again.
I wondered, you've obviously been involved in sort of policy debates for quite a few years, but do you detect any shift as a result of COVID in that sense of sort of what governments can do? Because traditionally there's the sort of politics of nanny state, but there's also free markets, and you know, don't interfere too much with business and let markets get on and sort stuff out. Did you sense any sort of shifting sands over the last couple of years as a result of COVID and governments having to
actually, and
do
I
more?
think we are. It's going to be really interesting now that the political parties have to line up to their manifestos. I mean, while I was in DEFRA for 5 years, I had 5 secretaries of state. I had 4 prime ministers. There were 4 potential. We marched DEFRA up to no deal Brexit and back again 4 times. And then we had actual Brexit, and then we had a pandemic, and then we had a war. And I think people are still kind of slightly in the political space, both in the civil service and politically, are still slightly reeling from all of that and haven't quite worked out. what they would need to do and what they and how they need to do that. So let me give you two examples. I think that the Tories are just they've suddenly got in number 10 someone who whatever you think about it, everyone in the civil service is like, thank God we've got a number 10 that actually operates now, because with Boris Johnson, Liz Truss just didn't operate. And then on the Labour side, I was doing Laura Kunsberg on Sunday morning, and I was sitting next to, I was on the panel, I was sitting next to the lead of one of the teachers' unions, and John Ashworth came on, and he kind of didn't say anything. He was trying, and the teachers' union woman said, I vote for this lot all my life. Well, they got to say something. They got to give us a message. So I think at the moment that they're slightly reeling, the politicians, and it'll be very interesting to see when they actually get on the front foot how they address some of these issues.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, the thing about net zero and 2050 is there's a sort of urgency to it, and I guess the financial pressures on the NHS and what Andy Haldane says about health and the impact on the economy, as that gets gradually sort of more broadly realised, maybe there'll be an increasing sense of urgency. But do you feel there's enough sort of urgency focused on food system reform in the UK?
No, I don't. I mean, funnily enough, I do think we might be on the tipping point of it. So, people like grandees who aren't in the fight, like William Hague or Tony Blair or whatever, are beginning to talk about it, and are beginning to say this is one of the big challenges. They're beginning to see it, AI, food systems. They're beginning to see it as one of the big challenges, but historically that hasn't been the case. But I think there's an opportunity to really get cut through on that in the next couple of years, and we need to. I've lost you. I think you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I've got lots of questions in the chat, so just looking to these. I think Jez has been pinging some.
I think the market one is really interesting, by the way. I think the energy market is a very, very good parallel to the food market, and the idea that with the energy market, the way in which it was into the interventions have started off with, they didn't just put in the cost of the externalities. Sorry, the question in the chat was, we don't talk about the energy market as a market. Why do we still talk about the food market as a market? And I think it's exactly right. There are huge externalities, there are huge problems. And in making that transition, you don't just put the cost, we didn't just put the real cost of carbon into energy early on. We put incentives in place in a direction so that the cost of alternatives collapsed. And then we began to put the cost of carbon in. And I think in terms of the environmental transition on food, you need to do something similar.
Yeah. You've got a couple of things about farmers and livestock producers. The sort of scale of the challenge for those primary producers in the system. Would you like to make a couple of comments on that?
It's interesting. So someone said, I'd like to see what the farming community, livestock community will say. And I mean, I speak to them a lot. I know a lot about it. So I think that if you are a farmer now in this country, if you're a livestock farmer, whether that's upland or lowland, but any kind of farmer, it's a very stressful place to be. You've got 3.4 billion pounds of land-based payments in the Common Agricultural Policy that are being removed from your P&L, and the government is trying to pay you for different things with those, which, as I said, is fraught with risk. You don't have at the moment, there's no long-term vision of where that plays out. And you haven't had with Liz Truss protection on trade deals, because there's obviously no point in creating a great food system here in the UK and then just exporting the harms abroad. So I think in terms of whether they believe in the transition, I think that there are a lot of farmers who do. There are even some livestock farmers who know that they need to reduce the amount of livestock we have in this country. but there is huge fear and anger and worry about how that's going to happen, not knowing it, and that sometimes exhibits itself as this is all ridiculous. But I think there's some good organisations. The NFU is showing great leadership. The CLA, which is another farmers' organisation, is showing great leadership. But it's definitely a very tricky time. It's a very tricky time to be a farmer.
We have a question about Scotland, and I know we've got people attending from Wales and I think Northern Ireland as well. The question about Scotland is, do you think that the Scottish, there's a particular Scottish initiative, do you think that goes far enough? Is it the Scottish Good Food Bill or programme? From your work, do you get a sense of, are there places that are sort of ahead of the game if you look across the UK that you'd point to particular sort of bold ambition?
In terms of policy across the UK, it's really interesting. So we had a group, a kind of UK group, because some of the policies are fully devolved, but you might learn from what other people are doing. So, for example, healthcare, there might be things, health is devolved, but you might learn from interventions. Or in fact, for school meals, thinking of Scotland. Some things are devolved, but actually you would want to be aligned. So, for example, there are, hundreds of farms that cross the Welsh-English border. And if you end up with two completely different regimes, that's going to be complicated. And then some things are not devolved. So trade policy is not devolved. And we learned a lot from those groups, I would say, and I haven't gone back to this since, I haven't looked at it in detail since probably, more focused on England, but since early 2022. But to characterize it, I would say that Scotland are ahead on thinking about food poverty, ahead of England on thinking about food poverty and some of those issues. Wales are ahead of England, or up there with England in terms of maybe a bit ahead in terms of the agricultural transition. Scotland probably behind on that. And Northern Ireland probably the most in terms of trade and using food and agriculture as an exporting asset are probably kind of ahead. So there's different things going on in different parts of the Union.
Thanks. We've got one going back to farming. We've got one from James Porter, who's a mixed farmer with, I think he's got beef cows and also soft fruit and veg. And he's talking about the value of having grass and clover in his arable rotation for his soil. So there's a sort of sense of to what extent is reducing meat likely to sort of make life difficult for that sort of balanced
I don't think it is. There are
system.
a lot of regenerative farmers now who are doing things like using sheep to graze cover crops so they don't need to use glyphosate, using ruminants to improve their soil. And if you look at the numbers required, that will still be possible. So I'm not so worried about that. There's an interesting, Kathy there has said, the audience is a nutritionists, and where do nutritionists and dietitians fit in? I thought it was net zero, so apologies if I got that the wrong way around. But I could absolutely talk about what your role is, because it's, for me actually. Yeah,
I'll just say we are a net zero network, but we don't ban nutritionists. We have nutritionists are welcome. So if we've got a few, yeah, sure, do go ahead.
So for me, the health transition is actually harder than the environmental transition, because the economics are more skewed towards bad practice. And I think that the government needs to make big interventions, both in terms of the commercial incentive of companies and in terms of supporting the diet of those in living in poverty. But there is also an enormous amount that needs to come from the bottom up. So, for example, if you look at when we did the school food plan, way back when, the work I did for government in 2013, one of the recommendations was that cookery should be on the curriculum for everyone up to the age of 14, which is now in the curriculum. And yet lots of I've got a charity that works on school food, and lots of the schools I go to still teach their children to make cupcakes. And so I think that there is, all of us, not just nutritionists, good food is made for people by other people who care, food that's delicious and nutritious. You need government intervention, it's necessary, but it is not sufficient. And I think all of us in our own communities should be looking at where it's going wrong and trying to intervene there. And that can be as little as going to your school and asking to eat a meal with your child. Many a school has turned around the food that they have started serving because someone's doing that, or it might be more broadly trying to get the food in your canteen changed. I was talking this to an MP who said, I'm going to go, and the food at the House of Commons is disastrous. I'm going to go and try and change that. So I do think we all need to act from the bottom up as well.
Could I get you to just explore it was fascinating, your little tables with the postcodes and the deciles, which showed the sort of relationship between diet and poverty. If we're to reform the food system from a health perspective and from a net zero perspective, how central is tackling food poverty in that challenge? Can we do this without really sort of centrally focusing on the social and access issues?
We can make it less bad, but we're not going to solve it. And this is not, food poverty is poverty. So the reason it is called food poverty is because it's the one thing that you can do is to skip a meal. You can't not pay your rent. You can't not buy your child their school uniform. There are all sorts of things you can't do. So food tends to be the last thing to go. And there are all sorts of reasons. We go into them in the food strategy and the book, Why Living in Poverty It Is Harder to Eat a Healthy Diet. And in the end, we also talk about how, our country is one of the most unequal in terms of the distribution of wealth in the world, and you're not really going to solve these problems until you solve that. But that is a huge, the economist Angus Deaton has a massive group of people working worldwide on what you actually do to do that, and it's tricky. So in the meantime, I think there are specific limited things that you can do as a state to improve the food people eat when they are in poverty. And the obvious ones are, expanding free school meals, which is only available to houses with a household income pre-benefits of less than £7,400, expanding Healthy Start, school food during the holidays, and then what we called Community Eat Well, which is helping giving free fruit and veg and cookery lessons to people who are really struggling. And since we published, Alexander Rose, a charity, has been doing that near me in Hackney, and the results have been quite extraordinary. They've given vouchers for fruit and veg to over 3,000 families. The number of children on free eating 5 a day in those families has gone from 7% to 64%. On average, the people in those families are having 3 more portions of fruit and veg a day. The parents report feeling healthier, more energetic, etc., etc., etc. So I think that you're not going to solve the problem until you solve the problem of inequality, but there are definitely things that you can do to reduce some of the pain.
Okay. Quite often people think of the food system as sort of dominated by these very large companies, and that they're powerful players, and they might be a brake on change. But in the introduction, or it might be in the executive summary to the National Food Strategy, and you mention it again in the book, that you were encountering senior executives in the food industry who were quite comfortable with the idea of government regulating to deal with the junk food cycle and to improve the overall sort of health and environmental performance of the food system. Was that just one individual, or is that something that you detect sort of, you know, can be said confidently about the sector?
Here's what's interesting to me anyway. So it was probably 6 or so of the major CEOs of the supermarkets and retailers. Only one, Roger Whiteside, who was the CEO of Greggs, now retired, would say it publicly. And I tried very hard to get them to say it publicly. And when they had, it was slightly different people who would have meetings with Department for Health, and at those meetings they'd say, well, yes, in theory, but it's very difficult, and they just throw enough grit again into the wheels to stop things happening. So clearly there needs to be intervention, and we need to create a level playing field. But you know, if you are, we said in the book, if you're a CEO of a company whose profits, 85% of your portfolio is deemed by the World Health Organization to be unsuitable to market to children, saying that though 85% of your portfolio needs to be made less commercially attractive literally would get you fired very quickly.
But just throwing a little bit of grit and that halts the system. That seems frustrating if there's a general sort of recognition of the sort of validity of the argument.
Take the example of the sugary drinks levy. So that, first of all, it was worked away on for years beforehand, gradually worked into shape, made kind of socialized, etc. Then George Osborne announced it, but he announced it through the budget. So the budget is the one bit of government where you don't have to write around. You'll know you're a former civil servant. So all for the civil servants on this call. So all policy has to be sent to all of the secretaries of state before it gets put over the line, at which point a lot of more grit gets put into the wheel, and they don't, you know, they say don't agree it. But so George Osborne did it through the budget, which is the one area where that doesn't happen. And then however many years after, nothing's changed. It's the same as it was then. Whereas we all know if you're going to kind of intervene in a complex system, you want to do it, see what happens, change it, do more, etc. So it is incredibly inertia, the kind of the natural weight of inertia against action is huge. And I think that is actually why it's important, you know, before any of the reason for writing the book, the reason for working with these kind of cross-party group of bigwigs is because it needs to become something that's central to the political understanding. In 10 years' time, whoever's in power is going to be spending an awful lot of time mopping this stuff up if we don't deal with it now. Yeah.
It was a massive piece of work and very authoritative but readable, the National Food Strategy. Given that we've got quite a lot of the audience will be academic researchers and scientists and so on, I just wondered, you know, UK's got really strong universities in a global sense, and strong traditions in agricultural science, environmental science, food and nutrition. Is there anything that struck you about the role of the research community, research councils and research groups and individuals in the UK context, where things could be done differently to improve impact or influence? You know?
Yes, definitely. So finally, after I was talking about this, I'm a visiting fellow at the Oxford Martin School at the moment, which is a kind of, you know, dealing with issues like climate change, things that go across multiple departments of the university. And I think this is a very coarse generalization, but I was sitting with a lot of different people who are proper academics, unlike me, and they agreed with it. You basically got two kinds of academics. There are the ones who take their idea out into the world and will go on the Today programme, go on, we'll go out there to try and sell the ideas. And there are others who think that those people are maybe a little bit full of themselves, have a bit too much ego, and they see their job as being to create really good science and to have people find it and to give advice to government. And I think many more, and it is true that some of those people who campaign and go out can be a bit irritating, can be a bit ego-driven, but we absolutely need it. So I think that non-political campaign, it can't be political or it's a disaster, but saying this is, a big problem and we need to fix it, and being prepared to go out there with new ideas, new thoughts is really, really important. And I think the second thing I'd say is, I edited this, my wife, as I said earlier on, edited this. One of the things that she said to me quite a lot was, what do you actually mean by this? And forced me to write the ideas in a way that the kind of rule of thumb was that our 12-year-old could understand. And I think a lot of academia could benefit from being forced to remove the jargon, particularly in the abstract, remove the jargon and write for a generalist audience. Because not only does that mean that the ideas travel more, but actually, I think you often find that if you can't write it in a way that a 12-year-old would understand, as you do that, you realize that actually you don't understand it as well as you thought you did. And so I think that is always a good a good practice. So I'd say write simply and get out there and communicate. Don't sit back, get out there.
That's great. That's really helpful. We're right up against 2 o'clock and we have a firm commitment to finish on time. So better stop there. There's lots more questions. We could have gone on for a lot longer, but I think we better give you a break. Thanks very, very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts, Henry. I just want to remind everyone that our next webinar will be on the 12th of May. Professor Charlotte Hardman from the University of Liverpool will be talking about net zero and dietary shift and the roles of psychology and poverty in food choices. So you can sign up for that event. I think Jez might be able to put a link in the chat, but if not, you can find it on the website. We're going to do a podcast as well, spinning out of the webinars. But finally, thanks to everyone today for joining us, and special thanks to Henry. That was really, really insightful and great value.
Thank you. I'm doing a longer thing. If anyone's in Oxford, I'm doing something at the Oxford Martin School. Some people are saying it wasn't long enough. And we're going to do something, I think, with a big period afterwards and a discussion and stuff. So if anyone can come to that, please do come to that.
And we put in the link to your select committee evidence this week. So if anyone wants some more now, you can just go to the link and see Henry before I think it was the Environmental Audit Committee.
Environmental Audit Committee, yeah.
Yeah, great. Many thanks again, and hope everyone has a good rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.